Bambi, hello. I forgot to ask you if it's morning, noon, or night there. Which one is it?
It is afternoon. It's 1 o'clock the afternoon on Sunday.
Perfect. So Eastern time for you, Eastern time for me, and we are synchronized, as they would say.
Absolutely. Okay, now that's kind of cool because sometimes when it's different time zones, we get messed up on, all of that. So I'm glad to be on your show today.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I can imagine that you're speaking to someone and then all of a sudden it's like nighttime for them and they're like dozing off as you're
I did one that it was actually from Australia, and yeah, and that was kind of different. That was kind of different because she was talking, about things that she was just the sun was rising as the sun was setting, on my end.
Oh wow. Did you feel like you're from two different worlds when you see stuff like that?
Absolutely. And then it's kind of funny because when you hear, I've been interviewed by people from Nigeria, I've been interviewed from people from Australia, somebody that is from Australia but living in Iran. Um, all places. It's amazing how everybody, loves the idea of podcasts to be able to hear other people's stories, and it's all across the world.
Yeah, it's interesting how you can if you stick a microphone in someone's face, they'll tell you all kinds of stories because we all have all kinds of stories, right?
Absolutely. I work for a company for the last 17 years. I worked for the United States Census Bureau, and now I work for a data company. And both those past 17 years, I've actually been in hundreds of people's homes listening to their stories. And if you just give them a moment, they'll tell you everything, and you'll learn all these, some things you didn't want to hear, but then they afterwards are like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I told you all that. You really made me feel safe. So if you are a storyteller and if you are a listener, people do want to tell their stories, and we just have to be brave enough to be able to tell ours so that they will have the courage enough to tell theirs.
Yes, there's this picture that I have on my background when I'm doing certain meetings, and it's a cloud, right? And it's a beautiful blue background sky, and you have this cloud, and then on the left-hand side is the cloud reaching out as a hand, right? And on the right, it's a hand reaching back, and right in the center, they connect. And it's like that to me when you have someone who you meet in your life, and you've created a safe space for them, and they're reaching out to tell your story. If you can make it comfortable enough and safe enough, they will tell you things that they'll think back and be like, oh my God, I was actually comfortable enough to share that with you.
Absolutely. And, that's why I wrote my first book, The Journey of Josephine. And it took me 25 years, 30 years to finally write the book. And part of the reason why I wrote my story is to be a first aid kit for somebody behind me. Because, our stories are not meant for us. As an author, I'm not going to keep reading my story. I read it once, closed the book, and said, wow, I'm not that person anymore. But now my book and my story will give other people the courage to be able to tell theirs. And I've realized, even in writing my story, that even culturally, it's so different from culture to culture and demographics to demographics of who's allowed to tell their stories and who holds their secret tighter because their culture doesn't allow you to tell their stories. So that's what I've learned through telling my story through my book, The Journey of Josephine, that everybody wants to be brave enough to tell their story, but even within cultures, you're not allowed to. And so for somebody to come in and tell their story, now they feel safe to be able to tell theirs. And the more stories that we tell each other and the more times that we're vulnerable, the more that we're locking our hands together and we're becoming a community and we're becoming a tribe. We all need our community and we all need a tribe. And sometimes they're just waiting for somebody to be brave enough to tell their story so that they can open up their mouths to be able to tell theirs.
Yes, and then you have the subculture within certain cultures that some people don't speak about, let's say some of the traumas they went through, such as, since this is Domestic Violence Month, such as abuse, such as being violated in some way, taken advantage of by somebody, by your partner, by your husband, by your wife, your boyfriend, your girlfriend. And it's interesting to sometimes hear when that person fully comes out and expresses it, that they're like, I always wanted to do that. And that ties us into a little bit of your journey. I know that for you, you've experienced some violence in your history and in your past. Speak to us. How did that start, and what was some of the impact it had on you earlier on?
I'm really glad that, we're doing this interview during October, which is, just like you said, is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And it's really a way for women and men and children to be able to be aware that they're not alone. We wouldn't have a Domestic Violence Awareness Month if it wasn't something that continues to happen, over and over again. And we need knowledge, and we need people to be brave enough to tell their story. It's no different than in September having Suicide Awareness Month, because it happens. And so we have these months to be able to have people begin to speak, about their journey. And, so this month I am a blogger too. So I'm writing my story on my, for my blog too. And I was thinking, how far back, can I remember that domestic violence was part of my life? And, my dad was a brutal alcoholic. My dad had come from a home they were alcoholics, and my dad wasn't one of those funny ones. He wasn't somebody that you're like, oh, dad's drunk, so now we're going to get some treats and we're going to, he's going to laugh a lot. My dad was a very mean alcoholic. And I remember far back as I was 4 years old, and we lived in a farmhouse. And I remember my mom putting my sister and I in the bathtub and telling us to stay there. And she had ran water, and there was bubbles. And for some reason, bubbles was not something that we had in our family. But here my mom puts bubbles, inside of the bathtub. So you knew something was about to happen, and my dad had pulled into the driveway. And he had come into the house, and he was drunk, and he was mean. And I remember the vision of me standing up in the bathtub crying and wondering what's going on, because we didn't know, because we were stuck in the bathtub. And my dad had become so mean and violent that he actually tried to pick up the refrigerator and throw it at my mom. So I remember, that was one of the first things that I remember. And I was like 4 or 5 years old. I remember when I was 8 years old, my parents split continually. My dad would get really drunk. He'd go to rehab, and my mom would split, and we would move. And then my dad would, not drink for a while. So then my mom would come back, and we would all have to go back with my dad. And I remember I was 8 years old, and my father had changed. My father had gone to church, and my father had gone to rehab, and he wanted his family back. And we lived in New York, and we had to move to Virginia. And I remember my mom was cleaning out our chairs, to pack them up, to put them in the U-Haul. And she was cleaning them because this is a kind of funny story. She was cleaning them because my brothers and sisters and I, whenever she served us liver, and she would leave the room, we would shove all the liver up inside of the chairs. So she was cleaning it all out. And I went to her, and I was 8 years old, and I said, Mommy, please, I don't want to go back to Daddy. And she just looked at me, and I said, please don't make us go. Can I stay with Grandma? Can I live with Grandma? And I remember my mom slapping me across the face and saying, Bambi, you don't understand. And we got into the U-Haul truck, and we, left to go to Virginia. And the first 6 months with my father, he was great. We went to church. He was singing and it was really good. And it only lasted 6 months. And then my father, started the drinking again. And he would line all of us up on the couch, and he would scream at us, telling us, that we weren't his, and that, we didn't belong to him, and he hated us, and he was just drunk. And I really hated my mom, for making us go, because I knew that my dad hadn't changed. And as an 8-year-old little girl, I knew. And when she slapped me across the face and said I didn't understand, and I didn't understand until 20 years later. I didn't understand until 20 years later when I got hit for the first time. I didn't understand until 20 years later when I got spit in my face and said that I was going to amount to nothing, and I was only trailer park trash. I didn't understand when I called my brothers and I asked my brothers to come and just beat him up a little bit so he would stop hitting me. I didn't understand until my brothers said, we will do that, but if you don't leave, we won't. So at those moments that I had to experience abuse from the hands of somebody that said that they love me, I didn't understand that question. And I didn't understand my mom's answer in desperation until I had to walk through it myself. We think we know all the answers, when we see other people, in really tough situations and in abusive situations. We want to tell them exactly how they're supposed to do their thing. And somebody asked me just recently, what would you say to a woman that is being abused? And I said, I'm probably not going to say something that you would think that I would say. But as a woman that has been in situations that my husband has choked me until I passed out, and then I wake up and he's laying on the couch as if nothing had happened. I didn't know that I would be the woman that I would make lasagna and he would smash the pan on the ground and it shatter all over the place, and take my spaghetti sauce and dump it inside of a sink. Everybody told me, Bambi, you're so strong. You're never going to be abused. But I couldn't tell people that I wasn't strong, that I was being abused. And so I tell women today that you have to make those decisions for yourself. I need to walk beside you. I don't need to tell you what to do. Because if I tell you you need to leave and then you leave because I told you, you're going to go back. If I say to my friends, I love you enough to walk beside you no matter what you go through, and that I will love you if you stay and I will love you if you go. But all that I want you to do is start preparing yourself for the time that you're going to be sick and tired of being sick and tired, and you're finally going to make an effort. Start taking the pictures of all your documents. Start going to the grocery store and getting gift cards that he's never going to notice that you got a gift card because you went grocery shopping. Start preparing things until that moment. And domestic violence is not the same for everybody. Some have it really bad, not saying that what happened to me wasn't bad, but it wasn't it was bad, but I've seen worse. And sometimes that's why I stayed, because I saw worse. And if this woman can put up worse than what I'm putting up with, then what am I complaining about? So there's so many things that go through a woman's head or a man's head of why we stay. And we can't judge the person for staying.
So let me ask you, when you saw that from a childhood and then you saw the impact it had on your family, your brothers, your mother, you as an adult, you shared your experiences. What do you think ultimately was causing that type of environment to happen?
Well, in my household, I know that my dad came, it was a generational thing. My dad's father was an alcoholic. All of his brothers were alcoholics. I just think that there was an identity crisis. But you have to remember, I'm 55 years old. So many things happened, as a young child that we didn't talk about as a society. We didn't talk about the effects of what alcohol, did in our homes. We're now starting to be able to be open and to talk about the things that have happened to us as young kids. And this generation gets to be able to be safe because they're able to talk about the things now when we were never allowed to do that. You never told anybody that you had a dirty old uncle in your household. You never told anybody that you had marks on your back as you went to school because your father was brutally beat you. You didn't talk about those things. And now we live in a society that I do think to a point that we talk too much, that this generation reveals too much, that sometimes, just because I gave you corn and I didn't give you beans doesn't mean I abused you. You don't know abuse until you've had to experience it in my generation. We didn't have places that we could go, you don't leave your family, you put up with it. I remember one time going to my grandparents' house, and my grandfather was sitting in the corner and he had his beer in the corner. And my grandmother was sitting by the sink and by the stove and she was stirring her pot. And when I looked at her again, she had a black and blue eye. My grandfather, just prior to us being there, had, it hit her. But she said nothing. She just continued to make the dinner because she knew people were coming over.
I know sometimes we have established this baseline where we think it's okay to correct behavior by using physical force. There's a time where if a child did something that was maybe inappropriate, or if you want to correct a child's behavior, use physical force. Now if you instill that in a child, they're going to grow up thinking that's right because that is their baseline. That's what they know. I did something wrong to prevent something wrong. I'm expecting to get the belt, the spoon, the hand, the shoe. As I grow up to be an adult now, if I'm trying to correct the behavior of your husband, of your wife, some people may default to that. Even though they remember how much they didn't like it, it's still so ingrained that they're going to say, okay, I'm going to slap him. I'm going to punch her. I'm going to kick. It's interesting how you see so many violent acts happening within the home because you have people who are so intimately involved. And a lot of times, especially for children, when they've experienced this type of abuse, it's from someone who's supposed to protect them, right? Someone who's supposed to
Mm-hmm.
love them, their mother, their father. They grow up, okay, my parents protected me this way. So when I get married, why wouldn't I be likely to exhibit the same behaviors? And you made a good point when you mentioned it passed down. Do you think a lot of times that's what it is? It's that the child sees their parents do it, the parents see their grandparents, and then generation after generation after generation, they're doing the same behavior, not knowing how wrong it actually is.
I do think that that is part of it, but I also, like my sons, there's a book that was written um about their relationships with their moms, and as a mom, our sons look at us as heroes in their lives. Our sons grow up and they want to marry their mommy. Their mommy is everything to them. When you're talking about to a child, to a young teenage boy, and saying, "Hey, if you won $1 million, what would be the first thing that you do?" And most boys and most men would say, "I'm going to buy my mom a house," because that mom is his hero, and especially if the mom was somebody that had to raise him as a single parent. But then there's a disconnect when a son grows up and sometimes there's a disconnect and the son moves away from his mother because now he realizes that his mother isn't a hero, that his mother is that his mother makes mistakes, that his mother is not somebody that is perfect. So he created an idol, over his mom. So now he's pulling away because now he's mad that his mother isn't perfect. And then until the man grows up and about 25 years old, a man finally has developed, all of his brain, kind of thing. And it's science. It's science. It's not me just saying that. Um, but they come to that point, and then they realize, wow, my mom did the best she could, but she wasn't perfect. And I think that sometimes in our lives, when we try to do things that our parents didn't do for us, we then become our parents then become idols to us because then we continue to say, I'm never going to grow up to be like them. I'm never going to grow up to be like them. And there comes a point that we have to put the line in the sand and stop saying we're never going to be like them, but we're going to try different avenues to be different and not judge them for what they've been through, but just accept it, forgive, and to move on. And then we can become different people. I remember my sons, my mom was not very nice. My mom was she was a mean, person. And, there wasn't a lot of affection. So when I grew up, I became a mom that did everything to an extreme. So all birthdays were like extravagant. Every time we went someplace, I overly did things for my children. And I even overly praised them, and not that you shouldn't praise your children, but I was very an intentional parent. And one of my sons for a while I have identical twin boys, and one of them didn't talk to me for a while. And finally, when we started having some conversation and stuff, he said, Mom, everything was a performance. So we always felt like it wasn't real because you always was a performance. And I created I did not beat my kids. I didn't abuse them, but I created the same thing, but different ways. And so my mom did this, but I did this. So I had to also then repent to my children and then begin to tell them why I did those things. I just never wanted my children to walk into a room and ever feel unworthy. I never wanted them to walk into a room and never felt like they were loved. So I went to the extreme. But I have children that don't speak to me because of that. So what was any different? I was trying to be so different that I created the same thing. And I think that as kids and as parents, the best way to raise great children is to understand that they're not your children. They have been gifted to you. They have been given to you to raise them, to intentionally build them to be men of God and and women of God that create the next generation, and give them more, and give them more abilities to be able to be different, and not take it so personally and try so hard to be a parent.
In general, there's so much training and so many classes for everything outside of marriage and raising children. There's a lot of
Yes.
books, there's a lot of how to, there's a lot of parenting for dummies, there's a lot of that. But one of the things that I always found interesting, and I don't have any children myself, but when someone is looking to make someone feel better or to appreciate them or celebrate them, they usually ask, or they usually are observant enough to say, okay, you know what? I know Bambi likes this. So if I'm going to celebrate her, I'm going to get that because I've seen a prior reaction to it. But we don't necessarily do that in our relationships with our spouse, and we don't necessarily do that with our children. Like, how many parents will go to their children when they're old enough to communicate what makes them feel good and say, hey, you did a good job. How would you like to be acknowledged and celebrated?
Mm.
Instead of us saying that this is what I like, I'm going to give this to my child, and my child might be like, after years of this, we thought it was performative. Because I think most people, the last thing that you would ever want to feel like is that the person is doing something for you so others can see it and appreciate it more than you do. Was that kind of the vibe that maybe that they were thinking of?
Yeah, and it's kind of like there is a book out there called the five languages of love by Gary Chapman. And I actually made all of my children take that test so I could see, like as an adult, to see. And I realized that I had a lot of words of affirmation children, because I was a words of affirmation. So, but I realized in reading that book, those gifts and those way that you receive love comes differently as you grow. Like, I wasn't raised in a household that was a lot of words of affirmation. So I became words of affirmation so I became words of affirmation out of brokenness, because I was broken and I didn't. And then the more that I became healed and transformed, and the more that I was able to look at the inner self of me, my love languages began to change. And the love languages began to change in my children. And my son I have 13 grandchildren, and one of my son has four of them. He has four sons. And, he calls me when he's on his way to work. And the other day we were talking about parenting and stuff. And he said, Mom, I realized in the few, whatever, I don't remember how many months or whatever, but he said, I realized that you were an intentional mom. Everything you did was intentional for us to become something in the future. And he said, and you were diligent at it. And I didn't see that until recently with my own sons, that everything has to be intentional. And he said, and I never realized that about you. And I didn't see that the gift that you really had given to us as kids. I never made a decision until I knew what the decision was going to cost them in the future. When they were boys, I knew that I needed to raise men. They weren't boys. I needed to raise men for the kingdom of God. So everything I did was based on raising them to be able to be an asset to our society. Same thing with my daughters. I had four daughters, and I did the same thing with them. I messed up a little bit on them because I was, I just gotten saved. I just became a Christian. I was a young mom. I was a mother with four daughters at the age of 22 years old. I was young. I made some mistakes. And because I never wanted people to think that our family was on welfare, so my daughters they towed the line. You didn't go outside that box, because I didn't want anybody to ever look at me differently because I was a young mom. And then just recently, one of my son, I have identical twin boys. The other one, I was at his house, and we've struggled with our relationship and stuff. And we began talking, and he said, Mom, for the first time I've realized, he goes, you've been through a whole lot, even before you turned 30 years old. And he said, and you accepted the crumbs that people lay down on the ground for you. And you never understood that you belonged at the table. And he said, so now I understand why you made some of the decisions that you made and some of the men that you got involved in, because they were crumb people. They were just throwing crumbs at you. And your worth was based on their crumbs. When your worth is, you get to sit at the table too. And that's what growth does. And that's what saying that I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired of staying in this broken body, and let's do the work. Let's get to the nitty-gritty of why I married the men that I married, why I allowed the things that I allowed in my life, what I saw within the mirror of my own reflection, and let's change the narrative. And that's what I've had to do, is change the narrative of who I am versus who I was or who you thought I was.
Yes, and that's a very good point because when it comes to domestic violence or domestic abuse, once we hear those two words, we automatically think that it's physical, but it could be mental, could be spiritual, could be emotional, it could be verbal. We don't necessarily give the same type of attention to the other ones outside of the physical. So when you have someone who's trying to be the very best that they can be, but they're falling short in some areas, they may default or they may result to overcompensating in one way. And that is a form of abuse in itself because you're mistreating someone in a way that you don't necessarily realize. And the five love languages, I always felt that people have a primary one and a secondary one. Like for
Mm-hmm.
me, growing up without my mother and my father, gift giving was like very important to me because I didn't necessarily have that as a child. Same with words of affirmation. The words of affirmation as I've grown older have stuck with me just because I think people don't say the words I love you enough and mean it. I
Mm-hmm.
think people throw around that word very loosely. Like you can say to an acquaintance, hey, you know what? I love you. Have a good day. But it doesn't, it loses its value because, like anything, right? Once you start to overuse it, or once there's so much examples of it in the market, it's not as valuable as something that's said once in a while, right? It's like comparing a Honda Civic to a Ferrari. Like a Ferrari is more precious because it's more rare. Honda Civic you see everywhere you go. So I always worry that just because we like something, we automatically assume someone else likes it. And then we push and we push and we push. And as you used a good word when you said intention, I think the intentions of people always have to be genuine and pure. And people can pick up on that. Like if you're pure in your intentions, people be like, you know what, Bambi really meant this. Even though it may not be something I really appreciate, I know her heart was in the right pace, in the right place. But when it's something that's like passive, like, here, Bambi, I got you this shirt, and the person is literally throwing it at you, it's not even wrapped, it's like an afterthought, then you're going to feel like an afterthought. So
Yes,
you mentioned,
absolutely.
right? You mentioned there's like some you don't necessarily have the best relationship with your children. What do you think can be told to maybe some parents out there that are in a similar situation to you that feel like they've mistreated or feel like there's different types of violence or abuse in their home, but they're trying to make sure that they can at least correct it and minimize some of the damage that's happened?
I I have 6 children, and I have 2 children that do not speak to me, and I haven't spoken, to them in a couple years. And so then I have the other 4 that I have relationships with. And I, as a mom, we did the best that we could with what the information that we had. The best place, for you to be, and because I am a Christian, is on your knees before God, and realize that when you see the pictures of a family all together, on Facebook, you see this really cute little picture and everybody's smiling, everybody's happy. And oh my goodness, they had their whole family together. I want you to realize that 10 minutes prior to that, that mother was screaming at her children. that mother was saying, you ruined my picture. You better be smiling. Don't you put those shoes on. You know that I picked out this. Why did you eat that chocolate? You knew we were getting pictures. So that picture that you're seeing didn't come with some adversaries, didn't come with every child going, okay, mommy, we love pictures. It didn't come that way, but that was the end result. And I just want people to stop comparing ourselves. We all have been through the muck of life. We all have been through things that we are not proud of. But we can take those situations and we can humble ourselves and realize that we just did the best we could. And when I have 6 children, and we always say, I heard something just recently that says, we always say, oh, I treated them all the same. I didn't. Because you know what? Each one of them was born in a different part of my healing. Each one of them were in situations that were different from the rest because I was a different person. So, and give yourself some grace. Parenting is hard. Parenting, and until we start digging up our past, we're going to create the same atmosphere as that was created to us because we haven't healed. The best part is to be humble, to realize that you're not alone. You are not the only mother that does not have her children. It's kind of like a red car. Everybody doesn't have a red car until you buy a red car. And then when you buy a red car, all you see is red cars. That's kind of like parenting, that as adult children that we suffer. I'm not the only mother. When I realized I wasn't the only mother that didn't have relationships with some of my children, it wasn't that I rejoiced in it, but it gave me a breath. It gave me like, oh, okay. Because I've seen some of these mothers and I've seen how they've raised their children, and some of their children didn't necessarily like the way that they were raised, and they don't have a relationship. So just continue to be on your knees before God and just continue to know that they have to work out their own lives now, that you can say you're sorry until you're sorry. And then after a while, I don't need to say I'm sorry anymore. I have paid the price for not doing it perfect. And now you get the opportunity as a mother or as a father to do better than I did. And continue to do that. And I think that as moms, we just need to know we're not going to do it perfect. And that's okay. But it's not over until the fat lady sings, and she ain't singing yet.
How difficult do you think that is for some parents to realize, one, they're not perfect, and two, sometimes they will have to say sorry?
Oh, I think that is a tough thing because we make excuses as parents. I know that I didn't do it perfect, but we make excuses for those behaviors that we did. And when we finally wake up and realize, wow, okay, I didn't have to do that, but I did. And to say you're sorry. To me, it was a humbling experience because I realized that I wasn't perfect, but I also realized that I made some good decisions. And sometimes as parents, we have a tendency to say, but I did this, I did this, I did this, instead of just saying, you know what? I'm sorry. I understand your perspective. And I'm sorry, and let's go forward from this. But yeah, a lot of times we have a tendency of not, because we're parents. I'm your mother. And I tell my children that a lot. Hey, I'm the matriarch of this family. I'm not part of the group. I stand alone. Well, if you stand alone in the matriarch of your family, then you also have to be humbled enough. And sometimes it's really, really difficult for us to be humbled. But things happen in life. I tell this story about, when my twins were younger, I homeschooled my kids for 27 years. So that was the other thing. Like, I thought, I homeschooled you. I made bread. I had the garden. I did everything. So I thought that, I was holier than thou because, come on, I homeschooled. I gave up my life for you. But that doesn't change, your children's atmosphere. But there was a time that we studied we studied about the Oregon Trail and about going out west. And so in the summer, I wanted to do something that brought that to life. So I found an organization that actually does covered wagon rides for a weekend, for a 4-day weekend. So I decided I'm going to do that. And during that weekend, it rained nonstop, never stopped raining. And we would have to go from the bus to this wagon, and then this wagon would take us to our destination for the evening. We'd have to go through this mud pile and go into the field, and there was a tent in the field that the Amish had made us dinner. So every night the Amish made us dinner. So it was so bad. And my tent was sitting on the opposite side of this trail that was full of mud and crap. And I looked at my sons and I realized at that very moment that a mother makes or breaks a vacation. If we don't like the vacation, everybody's going to know it. And everybody's going to be walking on pins and needles if mom's not happy. So I looked at my sons and I thought for a moment, oh my goodness, I've got to make or break this vacation. So I looked at my sons and I said, hey, take your shoes off. We're walking barefoot. I took my shoes off and I had to walk barefoot in mud and shit, horse manure. But I realized at that moment, for that whole weekend, we walked barefoot. And there was this one place that the latrine was right next to our tent. So in the middle of the night, I had to go to the bathroom. And at that time, the Amish had a horse and buggy there, but at night it was gone. Well, I didn't know that the horse crapped right there. So I had to sleep with my feet outside of the tent because they were full of crap. But I realized during that vacation, and I realize even now, that's life. That's what life is about. Life is full of shit. Life is full of mud. Life is full of rain. But it's what you do with the shit and what you do with the rain is what's going to impact everything. You're not going to get away from the crap. You're not going to get away from the manure. You're not going to get away from the sadness. You're not going to get away from the trials and the valleys. But it's what you do with that information that is going to impact you and impact your children into the future.
And that is a big first step outside of like identifying that you're actually going through it. Some people will spend many years not realizing the trauma that they have and how they've injected it into other people's lives. How were you able to identify what you're going through, and how do you think others can identify their trauma, their abuse, and work to heal as well?
Well, for me, it was definitely my relationship with Christ, and it was finding a counselor that really impacted me. I found a counselor that wasn't just a counselor that says, hey, I want you for 15 minutes a day, write down grateful things that you're grateful for. Hey, I want you to read this book for 10 minutes a day. I want you to do this and then come back and talk about it. I had found a counselor years ago that I would sit in her office and she would say, you know what, Bambi, what we're going to do is that we're going to ask the Holy Spirit to take you back to a moment in your life. And we're going to see where Jesus was in that moment. And we're going to see the lie that you believed in that moment. And we're going to find the truth of that moment. And when I think about that, one of the first places that I went back to is when I was born. When I was born, my father was drunk. My mom had my sister 12 months earlier. And here I had come into the world. My father went into the hospital and he said, let me see my son. And my mom said, you have a daughter. And he said, I don't want her. And so at that very moment, my eyes opened. And my mother said that she knew I was going to have a rough life. And so she wanted to give me a name that nobody would ever have to say, Bambi who? Like you have to say Susan who, because there's so many Susans in this world. And when I was in that counseling session, I was mad that my mother named me Bambi. I was mad that I was born into a family that didn't want me. And so I began to pray and said, okay, God, all right, my counselor says, let's do this. I'm praying and asking you, where were you? And I sat there for a moment and I looked over at the end of the bed and there was Jesus standing at the end of the bed saying and repeating, you were fearfully and wonderfully made. You were fashioned in your mother's womb for such a time as this. And I kept hearing him say that. And when I was done praying and when I was done thinking, I woke up and out of the prayer and I'm like, he really was there. I really was born for such a time as this. that there was no mistake. And it didn't matter who liked me and who didn't like me. God loved me. He loved me. There was another situation that when I had a brother and he was allergic to everything. And he was my father's pride and joy. He was, the boy of the family. He was my father's pride and joy. And my brother went into the garden and he had eaten some beans. And I didn't know. I was like 4 or 5 years old. And I ran into the garden. I said, don't eat that. You're going to die. Don't eat that. You're going to die. So I grabbed the food from him and I totally forgot about the day. My brother in the middle of the night, it wasn't middle of the night because they were up. My brother, when he went to bed, he started to cry and he's screaming, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. My dad brings him downstairs and said, who told you that? And he said, Bambi told me that. Bambi told me I'm going to die. And my mom put my brother back to bed. My dad called me. He goes, Bambi, Lynn, and you could hear it. And I walked downstairs and my dad had a belt on and I can still hear the sound of that belt coming off of his pants. And my father beat me till I couldn't walk because how dare I, say that his only son was going to die. And so that was always a traumatic time for me and always a traumatic memory. And so when that came up in our counseling session, I looked to the left and I saw Jesus opening up the door into my house and he's walking and he puts his hand on my father's shoulders and he said, stop being a bully. And the hitting stopped. It didn't mean that I didn't pay the consequences. And I'm not trying to be mystical. I know people are going to go, oh, okay, what's she doing? It was my way of being able to see that God really was there for me. It was the Holy Spirit being able to show me that he's never left me. I've had to go through some stuff in my life. I have been sexually assaulted. I have been raped. I've been cheated on. I've been hit. But I do know that it was never God's intention for me to go through all of that in my life. But he uses everything for his glory. For me to be on podcasts like this today and to say nothing changed except for my heart. And now my heart is healed and I can walk in forgiveness and I can see the hand of God always on my life. It wasn't what I wanted. I didn't get a picket fence. I didn't get the 2 children. I didn't get the rose bed, but I did get a life that I'm able to use for his kingdom. And I'm able to tell other people that I once was lost, but now I'm found. I once was blind, but now I see. I can't hide what I have been through, but I can tell you that I have grabbed hold of the hem of his garment and I have hung on for dear life for him to show me that I don't deserve crumbs in my life. I deserve to sit at the banqueting table. And every single one of us that sit at the banqueting table, there is a tablecloth at the banqueting table. And I believe the tablecloth is there. So all of our hurts and all of our pains are hidden. And we all sit at the table together as one. That we don't have to see everybody's pain and everything. We can sit at that banqueting table and we can sit as one.
Some people forget the power of support, no matter where it comes from, Bambi. It can come from your faith. It can come from a neighbor. It can come from someone at work. It can come from a friend. It can come from whomever. Many times it come within ourselves. We forget how strong we can be. I look back at my religious teachings and it always says that God won't give you more than you can handle. He teaches us that we are stronger than we know that we are because through him we have that strength. Now, if you take it outside of religion, there's a lot of people who go through a lot of things. And when you hear their story, you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you survived that. We are a lot stronger than we can believe. Like, just look back on everything that we've gone through. And sometimes we sit back, we're like, I can't believe I'm still here. Right, family? I still have 10 more years, 20 more years, 30 more years, 40 more years. When you look back on everything that you've gone through, when you share this story, you share the strength from your faith. You share the strength from within. How happy are you in becoming the woman that you are today?
Well, when I first wrote my story, the journey of Josephine, and my book came to my house for the first time, and I held my book in my hand, and I spent 6 hours reading, the book, and I cried and I wept and I, couldn't breathe in some of the moments that I had been through. But then when I closed that book, I realized I'm not her anymore. I realized that I have become and I am becoming who I was always meant to be. Those things in my life were never meant to destroy me, but they were meant to for good. If we think of the story, think of the story of the Bible of Joseph and his brothers. His brothers were jealous of him. So they threw him in a pit, for him to die. And then somebody found him and he became a slave. He was taken out of the pit and he became a slave. But then during the years of famine, his brothers had to come to the palace because now Joseph was somebody of importance. He was a slave, but then he became somebody of importance. And his brothers had to come, and his brothers, he didn't know, his brothers didn't know that it was him until they went through the whole thing. And then Joseph said, "It is me." You could look at Joseph, if you stop the story of Joseph only at the pit, then you don't get the finish of where he came from, because it's not the pit that matters. It's not the falling down that matters. It's not the tragedies that I've gone through that matters. It's the fact that I was able, and with people, with friends, with situations, and with my faith, I was able to crawl out of that hole. And I was able to write my story so that others could write theirs. I was able to go through that pit, not because I have an angry God, not because he doesn't like me, not because, he names me Bambi to shame me, but because he knew that for such a time as this, that somebody was going to need to know my story. Because for such a time as this, somebody today was going to listen to your podcast and was going to hear hope. That I wasn't created and I didn't go through crap in my life for me just to stay. It's because somebody needs that. You hear the story of Esther in the Bible. She was a young teenage girl. Probably imagine her getting married to a Jewish man, but yet the king wants her, and she has to go into the king's palace. But yet she was created and she was born for such a time as this to save her people. So do we say, oh my goodness, God, what did you do to Esther? No, she was able to save her people. And if we could just look at that, I'm able to save and to help the sphere of people that God brings into my life. I didn't go through the muck in my life to sit back and just still continue to feel sorry for myself, because there's been people that have it worse than me. But I praise God over and over again that he gave me friends. He saved my soul. I have friends that would allow me, said, "Bambi, we'll give you 10 minutes. And during those 10 minutes, you swear, you curse, you throw, you scream, you do whatever you need to do. But after those 10 minutes, Bambi, we're going to now tell you the truth, because it's only the truth that's going to set you free. We're going to tell you the truth. So the bondage that you are in and the prison gates that you are in are going to be opened up, because we're not meant to stay in prison. We're not meant to stay in the prison of our minds. We're meant for the prison gates to be opened up and set us free. And I hope that I am born because today somebody needed me. I hope that God can look upon me and say, I created you in your mother's womb for such a time as this. I fearfully and wonderfully made you in your mother's womb because somebody was going to need you. Somebody was going to need my story. Somebody was going to need to know that somebody's at the finish line cheering you on also to get to the finish line. Somebody was going to need my book as their first aid kit. Somebody was going to need somebody to be plowing the field for them to be able to come through into the field. And I hope even in your podcast that is your vision. Your vision is to help the ones that need to be helped. Your vision is to tell the stories, that the stories can become something that will heal and transform people. We are not here by mistake. We are not even here together by mistake. You are stinking in Canada and I'm in Georgia. Like, how, that's nothing but divine appointments. That's nothing but, no matter what you believe or where you believe in things, all of this is divine appointments. And we were all created not for ourselves, but for the other people behind us. And I think that's pretty amazing.
How powerful do you feel that your survivor story is becoming someone's inspiration story?
I'm humbled. I'm humbled. I'm humbled that God would use a broken little girl. I'm humbled that he would use a person that all of her life had turned into ashes and he turned them into beauty. I'm humbled to think that God took, this teenage girl, no education, and he has made me more educated than I could ever have been, in society. I'm humbled that he would use a wretched person like me to bring healing and hope to the people behind me. When you think about the stories of, like think about the story of even the oyster. If people like research the story of the oyster, here the oyster is going through, all of this turmoil and the waves are crashing at it. The parasites are trying to get at it and everything's trying to destroy what is inside. But what's happening when they're coming after him, what's happening inside is that pearl is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That pearl is getting bigger and bigger through the parasites, through the sand pushing up again, through the waves crashing on it. And then when you open up the pearl, it is something of magic. It is something of beauty. But it didn't get there from just sitting and having nothing be touched, them not being touched by it. If you think about the life of the caterpillar and how the caterpillar has to go through this whole process and goes into a chrysalis, and his mind is the mind of the caterpillar, but he's got to put on the mind of the butterfly in order for him to fly. But there's things that had to happen inside of that chrysalis for that butterfly to be able to come out and to emerge into something great. There is nothing that happens to us that God's not going to use. And there's not one person in this whole entire world that hasn't had something happen to them. There's not one person in this world that doesn't have a story to tell. There's not one person in this world that hasn't had some brokenness and some pain that has happened and some dreams that didn't come true. But if we can know that all of those ashes of our lives does turn into something beautiful. When a house is burnt down from fire and all you see is the ashes, and if you see beyond the ashes, you see that you can rebuild. And you can rebuild something even bigger and better. You can get the kitchen that you've always dreamed of. You can get the bathroom that you imagined that you were going to get, but you got all that because something burned down. So we are not, all of us are not going to leave this world without some scars and without some stories and without some crap that we've had to walk through.
Anytime I think of trauma or when I interview guests, I always think of some of these children's stories that were told, and you don't necessarily think anything of it until when you become an adult. You're like, wait a minute, okay, people are damaged in some way, broken, they've been hurt. And I think of the story of Humpty Dumpty, who had a great fall and then he had been put back together again. I think that's a lot of adults who have been hurt, who've been abused, who've been manipulated, who've been taken advantage of, who've been scammed, who've been broken, damaged. There's these broken pieces of us. We've fallen down. Sometimes we can't get up by ourselves. We need someone else to help us. We need someone else to put us together again to help us along those lines. And I always think of Humpty Dumpty's story because we are, in a lot of ways, so fragile as
Mm-hmm.
people, as an individual human being. And then because we have so many people coming into our lives, and unfortunately so many people coming out of our lives, it leaves its impact and it cracks us a little bit until that one person comes along and completely breaks a part of us. But that's where we find the support. Like you mentioned your faith as your support. Was there any other areas where you received support and you were so grateful that you got it?
Well, God has given me amazing friends, amazing friends that have walked beside me through this journey and through these seasons, of my life. They were people that never gave up on me, and my precious daughter, my oldest daughter is 37 years old. And the day that I found out that I was pregnant for my daughter, I was actually in a children's psychiatric center because I had tried to commit suicide and end my life. And when I went there, when they brought me to this psychiatric center, that was where I found out that I was pregnant for my daughter. And she's 37 today, and she is one of my greatest supports. She is one that has been loyal to me through thick and thin and has gone through so many things, that she could have turned her back on her mother, but she has always loved me unconditionally. And I would say that she is definitely somebody that, has given me hope. And, I read a lot, so a lot of sitting and researching things and trying to find the stories within things, and yes, I am a Christian and I love Jesus because I know that he set me free. And I see right now I'm writing my third book, and I'm writing it about the women of the Bible, different women of the Bible, and having to take their stories and making them more relatable today, to tell their stories of today. And I was thinking that, today is, this month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And, there is a story in the Bible that we can look back and see what God did to a woman, that she was married to a very angry man, and he wasn't very nice. And David's men there was a battle that was going on, and David needed food and things like that. And there was a woman named Abigail that, even though her husband was a very angry man, his name was Nabal, she still went out and fed David because David was a king. She had to go out and and feed the king, feed his army, feed his tribe. And I imagine Abigail trying to give some hints of what she was going through in her life, and trying to, find a way for her to be able to tell. And she wanted David to take her, and David rode off without her. And I could feel, as a woman that has been in an abusive situation, I can feel her pain of her walking back to her home going, he didn't take me. He didn't see that I'd been abused. He didn't see that I wasn't taken care of. And she had to go back into her home with her angry husband. But her angry husband drinks. And then 3 days, he gets so drunk that 3 days later, he dies. He dies. And David hears of the news that Abigail is no longer married. And he comes and he grabs Abigail. Now, we can look at that story, and we can look at the beginning of the story and say, what did David keep her there for? David was the king. He could have had anybody. We know he could have had anybody because he had Bathsheba. He took Bathsheba away, so he could have helped Abigail. But then when you begin to see the story unfold, that God really did have a plan for Abigail's life. He really did see her. He really did set apart. He really did have a solution, for her life. It was sometimes the solution that God had for our lives, in an abusive situation. I went on a fast for 20 days, 22 days for God to answer, my prayer of, please, God, what can I do? And every night I would anoint my house with oil, every point in my house. And I would go around marching around my house and praying all the verses that were in my house and saying, God, do you see me? Do you see me? Kind of like Abigail. God, did you see me? Did you see me? And at that one moment in time, I knew that God saw me, and a situation came up in our family that I wasn't there, that it took place. And my husband was now gone from my house. That situation with Abigail came forth that her husband dies of alcoholism, so to speak, dies, but God gave her a way of escape, and he came back, and he's going to continue to give people the way of escape. Our situations and the circumstances that women are in today, and if you're in an abusive situation, God's got a way of escape for you. God does care for you. God doesn't want his daughters to be treated the way that they are being treated. And I know that today that God is working on behalf of your situation, and he's going to give you that way of escape. It may not be today. It was 22 days that I had to fast. It may not be 3 days after Abigail served the king that her husband dies, but God does have a way of escape for you.
Do you think sometimes we miss the signs, and because of that, we don't necessarily take it upon ourselves to do the work required to come out of those situations.
Absolutely. I think that sometimes it's fearful. For me as a mom, I didn't come out of that situation. I stayed in the situation that I was in because I had 6 kids. And if I was to leave those situations, then maybe by chance he was going to have my children every other weekend and one day a week. I wasn't willing to do that. I was willing to take the abuse for him not to have my children, in any situation. When you are in an abusive situation, a lot of times you don't have the money. And we know that people are only going to help other people for like 3 weeks. After a death happens, you're around that person that has to be comforted about 3 weeks, and then you move on to your own lives. Sometimes there's no place for women to go, and they know that. And they know that they're going to feel like a burden, because there is going to be a moment that they are going to be a burden, because as people, we can only help for so long, and then our brains aren't capable anymore. There are so many reasons. I'm a born again Christian. I would go to prayer meetings and they'd say, Bambi, make a pie. Make a pie for him that evening, because maybe if you make a pie, his favorite pie, he's going to be okay with you. I was told, in those situations, I was told continue to be intimate with him, because that's spiritual warfare. I'm being abused, but I'm supposed to do this. And I think that now things are changing. Things are changing within the church. They're realizing that there is so much abuse within the church, and that people are now starting to advocate, for us. But it's scary. It's scary because an abuser, a narcissistic abuser, he tells you somewhat the truth. And you're like, oh, I did do that. But he twists it in a way that you're doubting yourself all the time. So you just have to know the signs, and you just have to know and believe and stand upon yourself, and not, I think that sometimes women get caught up in the abuse, because then they become a victim, and then they don't have to then look at themselves outside of the abuse, because the abuse is the elephant in the room. But when you take the elephant out of the room, now you have to deal with yourself. You have to deal with your own heart issues. And sometimes it's very difficult, because you don't get the same kind of sympathy as you would when you're in an abusive situation.
Yes, there's some people that once they take themselves out of that situation, they don't do any self-reflection, because for some people, it's easier to tell that story, like the victim story. And there's people out there that unfortunately they seek that out because that's all that they know. They think it's normal for me to go from an abusive partner to another abusive partner to another abusive partner, not knowing that if that is your track record and you're not healed, eventually, and this is where it's a bit unfortunate, sooner than later, you're going to meet someone who isn't like your previous abusive partners. And you're going to bring chaos into their lives, and then you're going to abuse them
Yes.
in a type of way. Have you seen that as well?
Oh, absolutely. And because we become people of the condition of our hearts. We think whatever your heart is, if your heart is broken, you're going to get yourself involved in broken people. And if you are broken, you're going to try to, instead of dealing with yourself, you're going to vomit on everybody else around you. And there comes a point that people are tired of getting the vomit off their faces, because, and I'm not saying that women are choosing to be abused. I didn't choose to be abused. I didn't choose to have somebody not value me. I didn't choose to have somebody, treat me the way that he treated me. But there were some characteristics, and there were some things that I did that I should have seen the signs and never walked into the situation. But because I thought that I could change the situation got worse. I sat down with his ex-wife, and she told me the abuse that he had done to her. And I still married him. I still saw things before we were dating, but then I ended up getting pregnant, and I was afraid of what was going to happen if I didn't marry him. So I made some decisions based on my way of wanting to protect my babies, wanting to protect the situation, and then also the embarrassment. I married out of the embarrassment because I was a member of a church and I was teaching Sunday school. And so I married out of an embarrassment that I didn't want people to look at me like the woman with the 6 husbands, or the woman that was they were ready to stone her. So I made those decisions, and I stayed because I wanted to wait long enough for my sons to get old enough to be able to tell their own story. And because if I would have left early, he would have had my sons every other weekend and one day a week. And I wasn't willing to do that. So there were situations and there were decisions that I made that were not the right decisions. But because I felt like I made a decision, I had to pay the consequences of those decisions. But I was a victim of his abuse, but I was not a victim of the whole situation. I played a part in it.
That's an interesting take, and I will agree. I will agree that there's some people that are victims of someone's behavior, in this case, the abuse, the violence, the trauma, and then there's those same people that are a victim of their choices.
Yes.
And there's a lot of times where the victim, being a victim of your own choices, will last longer in your life than you being a victim of the person's abuse, because you can escape that person or distance yourself from that person, but not a lot, but you can't escape yourself.
You
You
can't.
can't,
And then you
right?
have to look in the mirror. You have to begin to start looking in the mirror and seeing yourself for who you are, and see yourself with all the flaws, and admit those flaws, and admit those scars that some people gave to you and then you gave to yourself. But that's hard to do. That takes courage, that takes guts, that takes awareness, that takes people not just looking at you as the victim. It takes responsibility, to be able to finally come to a point of taking responsibility for your own behavior, taking responsibility for your own choices, and being okay and saying, yeah, I failed. I have failed, but I also have gotten back up again.
And I wonder how much embarrassment, because you mentioned, I wonder how much embarrassment and shame plays a part in us making bad choices just because we want the illusion that it's a good choice to others.
I bet it's a lot. I bet there's a lot of people that are ashamed of the decisions and the choices that they have made in their lives. And they feel like they have to stay in it, pay the price. But you don't have to stay in that to pay the price. You don't have to continue to stay there and pay the circumstances. The circumstances happen, but you can finally remove yourself of those circumstances and live with what you did. And it's okay, but there's nothing but, if you live with what you did, there's nothing but the blood of Jesus that can wash you white as snow. We all have crap. We all are sinners. We all have gone through things in our lives. We all have made decisions, that poor decisions. We've been in situations that we should have never walked into. But the grace of God is sufficient, and the blood of Jesus can wash you. And once you accept that washing and you see yourself for who Christ sees you, oh my goodness, life is so much better. Because when I look at it, when God sees me and he sees the mess that I'm in, I don't believe that he sees me. I believe that he sees his son that died upon that cross to set me free. And all he wants me to do is to put on the mind of Christ, to look at things, because the Bible tells us for us to daily wash ourselves with the word daily. So when Christ sees me, when God sees me, he sees his son. He doesn't see the yuck of me because he's already washed me. But he wants me to believe that. He wants me to say, he set me free. I'm dirty. I'm I'm like that puddle, that mud puddle of manure that I had to walk through. But you know what? Once you've walked through that puddle, once you walk through that manure, I learned that manure and shit and mud is the best pedicure you'll ever have in your life. And it will make your feet the smoothest. But I had to walk through it to find that out. You
And
you have to walk through the healing in order to realize that you were so broken. When I read my story, and when I'm on these podcasts and I have to tell someone my story, you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that. But I'm not that anymore. But sometimes people don't want to take those first steps to not to be this broken person that they are, because they feed into it.
they do.
But
They do, right?
after a while, nobody's going to be there for me. After a while, people, if I didn't change, I wouldn't have the most amazing friends that I have that have walked this journey with me,
And
because they're
then
not going to
like,
put up with it.
yeah, then if you like, if you ask yourself, I have to make a decision, right? Either I'm going to look good to others and suffer, or I'm not going to look good to others and be happy. It's interesting to see how many people will suffer as long as it makes them look good in front of other people. And it goes to your point where the shame, the guilt, I'm like, I don't want anyone to think that I'm a single mother or a single father with children, or I've been married 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. I'm going to stay in this so it looks good on the outside, but I'm suffering. I'm being hurt. I'm being damaged in some way versus I'm going to focus on my happiness. But some people may think that, oh my God, he's so crazy. How come he's on his fifth wife? Or what's wrong with Bambi? She has a high number of children. I always found it interesting on the outside looking in. We know which answer or which course of action should be taken most of the time. But when you're actually in it, many of us take the other way where it's like, I'm going to suffer in silence as long as I still look good to other people.
That is so true. But you know what? They all, we all have a fly. It's kind of funny when we say, "Oh, I wish I was a fly in their wall." If everybody was a fly in our walls, we would all realize that we all have some stuff. If we all realize we all have some things that we have to work through, you know, but by the grace of God go I. I've made some really poor decisions. I was married twice. One husband, cheated on me. The other husband, beat me. And I wasn't married for like 7 years. And I met a pastor. So I didn't see the flaws in him. I didn't see the things that weren't right, because now I'm going to be a pastor's wife, and nobody's going to see all the stuff that I have been through, because now they're going to see me as a pastor's wife. So I ended up marrying him, and then I ended the relationship because I found out that he had an extreme mental illness, and that his family wanted me to be with him because they wanted me to help him take over his church and help him run his church. And I remember going to Burger King, meeting him at Burger King, looking at him and saying, "Don't you ever call me again? Don't you ever talk to me? Don't find me, erase my number. This is over." And I got into my car and I realized that he not only lived a facade, but so did I, because I didn't want anybody to see me again as the woman at the well. I didn't want anybody to see me again as the woman that was thrown down. And Jesus says, "Who has sinned, cast the first stone." So I was willing to be a pastor's wife to a man that had an extreme mental illness, to be able to hide my own shame. When all it did, it created more shame. It created more shame that I had to live with those consequences and live with that decision, that I created more shame because I was ashamed of how people saw me. And when I really should have only been caring about how God saw me.